The year was 79 AD, and late summer had settled over Pompeii. Death was not on anyone's mind, neither was disaster nor any thought of endings. What occupied the city instead were familiar concerns: the oppressive heat, financial matters, the latest gossip, and whatever tomorrow might bring. Sharp shadows fell across stone walls as the sun rose above the rooftops, illuminating surfaces painted with everything from advertisements to crude jokes, from insults to promises. One by one, wooden shutters began to creak open. Behind them stood shops that had claimed the same spots for decades. Bread emerged from ovens that had been built directly into the city's infrastructure, pulled out by bakers who had done this same work for years. Clay cups were filled by wine sellers who mixed yesterday's remaining stock with water before serving it. This morning brought no new beginning to Pompeii. It simply brought continuation. Quiet had never been Pompeii's character. Sound traveled with ease through streets so narrow that the buildings seemed to lean inward, as though exchanging confidences. One conversation bled into another. Arguments echoed from block to block. Even in the early hours, laughter could be heard spilling from taverns. Stone pavements, worn smooth by countless feet and wagon wheels over generations, felt the impact of barefoot children running. Animals wandered among the crowds, existing in a state somewhere between wild and tolerated. Physical proximity defined the city. Social proximity did too. Public life and private life existed with barely any separation between them. Those who called Pompeii home did not experience it as ancient. To them it felt familiar, functional even. Aqueducts brought running water into the city, street corners featured fountains, public baths operated using elaborate systems of furnaces and pipes that generated heat. Along the streets, fast food was available for purchase, with hot meals sold directly to passers-by who never needed to step inside a building. Entertainment was there. So were politics, religion, sex, and violence, all woven seamlessly into the rhythm of everyday existence. The city simply worked. This functionality bred confidence in those who lived there. Mount Vesuvius loomed above, a presence so familiar it had become essentially invisible. Vineyards covered its slopes, along with farms that thrived in soil enriched by eruptions so ancient that no one retained any memory of them. The mountain posed no threat in the minds of Pompeii's residents. It functioned as mere backdrop, part of the landscape, in the same unremarkable way the sea formed part of the horizon. No living person had witnessed an eruption. Stories handed down through generations carried no warnings about what the mountain might be capable of unleashing. A danger no one remembers is hardly perceived as dangerous at all. Some years before, violent shaking had torn through the ground. Buildings had cracked open, walls had come down. Damage throughout the city had required years of repair work. But earthquakes struck the region with some regularity. They were viewed as disruptions rather than omens of anything worse. Repairs were completed, frescoes received fresh paint, life returned to normal. The lesson Pompeii extracted from this experience was not one of caution, it was one of resilience. The city endured whatever came its way. Sharp contrasts defined Pompeii's character. Massive houses consumed entire city blocks, concealing gardens, pools, and elaborately painted rooms behind exterior walls that revealed nothing. Inside these spaces, the elite created environments filled with images of gods, heroes, and idealized displays of power. Their lives were deliberately constructed to broadcast success and control. Just a few streets away, a very different reality existed. Families occupied cramped quarters above workshops or tucked behind shops, their existence shaped by constant labor and relentless noise. Moving between these two worlds were slaves carrying water, food, messages, and children. They formed an invisible infrastructure that kept the entire city functioning. Their presence was everywhere, yet acknowledgement was rare. They were so normal they went unquestioned. The city made no effort to hide its true nature. Walls displayed open expressions of desire. Political rivalries became public through graffiti scrawled on any available surface. Brothels conducted business openly, advertising their services through images rather than written words. Gladiators enjoyed celebrity status. Children were not shielded from violence. Instead, it was celebrated in arenas constructed at the city's edge. Religious practice was more practical than spiritual. Gods received honor not from love, but from expectation. People made offerings to secure specific outcomes: protection, luck, profit. Faith operated as a transaction. Then the shaking began. People looked up. Finally, they saw it. From the mountain, a massive column of ash and smoke was climbing skyward, rising higher than anything that it could have imagined. Its ascent was not gradual. It surged upward at terrifying speed, dark at the base and expanding as it climbed, forming a towering shape that seemed to challenge the sky itself. No one possessed language adequate for what they were witnessing. This was not fire. It was not any form of weather they knew. It existed completely outside their collective experience. Ash started to fall. Initially, it was light enough to simply brush aside. Nervous laughter emerged from some people. Others stood pointing. Some remained frozen, trying to determine whether they were witnessing spectacle or warning. The city hesitated. During that hesitation, precious time slipped away. The sounds filling the city changed again. Conversation dissolved into shouting. Orders were given and promptly ignored. Somewhere, metal crashed against stone as a roof gave way under increasing weight. Animals began screaming and breaking free, adding their panic to the mounting chaos. People began to understand, not through rational thought but through instinct, that this situation would not simply pass. Yet understanding brought no clarity. It brought paralysis instead. No one had ever rehearsed for this. Plans did not exist, neither did drills. No shared memory of survival guided anyone. The city gates, once representing connection and trade, transformed into bottlenecks of pure terror. Crowds pressed forward, coughing and screaming, clutching at children and possessions that would soon need to be abandoned. Some were trampled, others reversed course, realizing too late that escape routes had already been compromised. Beyond the city walls, ash continued falling with the same relentless intensity. The roads offered no clear sanctuary, only exposure to the elements. Within Pompeii itself, buildings started to fail. Roofs never designed to support such heavy loads collapsed without warning, crushing anyone who had sought shelter beneath them. Walls cracked and surrendered. Entire rooms vanished within seconds. The city that had felt so permanent just hours earlier was unraveling piece by piece, not through a single dramatic collapse, but through countless small, brutal failures occurring simultaneously. Hours passed in this manner. Time lost all conventional meaning. There existed only before and after, movement and stillness, noise and silence. Some people simply lay down, exhausted beyond the capacity for fear, convinced they could go no further. Others kept moving, driven by nothing beyond basic instinct, pushing through pain and complete disorientation in the hope that survival lay just a little farther ahead. What was coming next remained unknown to them. Pompeii still existed, buried but breathing, filled with people making their final choices in complete darkness. Climbed onto furniture to stay above the rising layer covering the floor, unaware that roofs above them were quietly absorbing more weight than they could possibly support. When collapse finally came, it arrived without any warning, a sudden, violent release that left no time for reaction. Sometime during the deepest part of the night, the eruption underwent a change. The sound altered in a subtle but distinct way, growing sharper and more violent. The ground trembled again, but this trembling felt different, more focused, as if something were racing downhill at tremendous speed. What followed was not more falling ash, but heat itself. A blast of superheated gas and ash surged outward from the mountain, traveling faster than any human could possibly run. It did not announce its arrival with fire or visible light. It announced itself with pressure, a sudden, overwhelming force that crushed lungs and extinguished life within seconds. Those caught in the open had no opportunity to understand what was occurring. The air itself turned lethal. Breathing once or twice was sufficient to end consciousness. Bodies dropped where they stood or lay. Inside some houses, people died still holding one another, their final moments frozen in positions expressing fear, protection, or surrender. The city was not burned. It was smothered and sealed. Another surge followed, then another. Each wave erased more movement, more sound, more life from the city. Pompeii did not fall in a single instant, but through stages, each one quieter than the one before. The chaos characterizing the earlier hours faded into stillness, broken only by the continuing rumble of the mountain and the soft, endless sound of ash settling into place. For centuries, Pompeii remained asleep beneath its own ending, preserved not through any intention, but purely by accident. The same force that had destroyed the city had also sealed it away, protecting walls, objects, and even human forms from decay. A city caught in the very middle of living had been transformed into a time capsule, waiting for a future that did not yet exist. For a very long time afterward, nothing happened at all. Seasons came and went. Rain fell and soaked into layers of volcanic material that had sealed the city like a lid pressed down tight. Grass began growing where rooftops once stood. Farmers plowed fields without any knowledge they were cutting furrows directly above temples, kitchens, bedrooms, and human bodies. Life reorganized itself around the void, as it invariably does. The Roman world continued onward. Centuries folded themselves into one another. Rome itself underwent changes beyond recognition. Emperors arrived and departed. New religions rose and replaced older gods. Languages shifted over time. Stones from abandoned structures were pulled out and reused to construct new buildings. The past was not carefully preserved. It was simply recycled. During the early modern era, people digging wells and foundations began striking walls that did not belong to any known structure. Statues emerged without any context to explain them. Painted surfaces appeared briefly before sustaining damage or being buried again. These discoveries were treated as mere curiosities, valued only for their decorative potential. No one yet grasped that an entire city was waiting below. Truly uncovering Pompeii required a different kind of mindset. Not treasure hunting, but genuine curiosity. Not conquest, but systematic excavation. Pompeii began telling a story no written text could ever convey. Not a story of emperors or battles, but of mornings interrupted, of meals never eaten, of plans that ended mid-thought. It revealed a Roman world not polished by centuries of history, but frozen in complete truth. As more of the city emerged into light, something became abundantly clear. Pompeii was not important because it had died. It was important because it had lived. What those first excavators uncovered proved unsettling precisely because it felt so familiar. This was not some distant heroic past constructed from marble statues and grand inscriptions. This was a city that appeared as though people had stepped away from it only moments before. Streets still carried the grooves worn by carts. Doorways still showed the marks left by hands that had pushed them open every single morning. In kitchens, pots sat on stoves, as if simply waiting to be used again. The past did not announce itself as something past. It felt merely paused. As the digging continued, something even more disturbing started to appear. Not just structures, but actual people. Initially, they were discovered as bones clustered in strange positions, twisted or huddled together in ways suggesting fear rather than any kind of ceremony. Some lay near doorways, others were found in courtyards, and some had fallen along streets that had once seemed to promise escape. Their positions told stories no historian could possibly invent. Families pressed tightly together, individuals attempting to shield their faces, bodies curled inward as though nothing but instinct had guided their final moments. Then came a realization that changed absolutely everything. The bodies themselves had decayed long ago, but the ash that had buried them had hardened around their forms. What remained were hollow spaces shaped like human beings at the precise moment life had left them. When plaster was poured into these voids and allowed to set, the city surrendered its most intimate secrets. Faces emerged from the casts. Hands appeared. Individual fingers became visible. Even the folds of clothing could be seen. Pompeii did not just reveal that people had died there. It showed exactly how they had died, how they had reacted, how they had tried to protect one another, and how little time they had actually possessed. These figures were not heroic in any traditional sense. They were simply ordinary. A child clinging to an adult. Someone raising an arm in an attempt to shield their face. Another person collapsed alone, separated from everyone else. The distance between survival and death was measured in steps, sometimes in mere inches. Pompeii transformed catastrophe into something deeply personal, something impossible to abstract or romanticize in any way. Pompeii exists now in a strange state, neither fully alive nor completely dead. It continues revealing new details, even as parts of it steadily fade away. It serves as a reminder that civilizations do not vanish only through war or gradual collapse, but sometimes through moments so sudden that no one has time to understand what is actually happening. The city that once placed complete trust in the ground beneath it became the clearest possible warning about ignoring what feels permanent. It demonstrates how ordinary life can sit directly on top of disaster, how comfort can grow from underlying danger, and how history is often shaped not by what people expect, but by what they fail to imagine could happen. Still, the story does not end there. Pompeii is not only about destruction or eventual discovery. It is about what remains after the initial shock fades, about how societies make choices regarding what to remember, and about what a buried city can teach the living long after all its voices have gone permanently silent. For the first time, scholars could actually walk through an ancient city and observe how physical space shaped human behavior. They could trace how wealth tended to cluster, how businesses spilled outward into streets, how public and private life overlapped and intersected. They could see where people naturally gathered, where they actively avoided, where they chose to linger. Pompeii transformed archaeology into something intimate. Instead of asking what Romans believed in abstract theory, it showed what they actually tolerated, what they genuinely enjoyed, what they chose to ignore. The city became a record of actual habits rather than stated ideals. This shift proved unsettling. Pompeii made it impossible to romanticize Rome in any complete way. The evidence was too clear, too undeniably human. Brothels stood next to bakeries, lavish villas shared borders with cramped living quarters. Graffiti revealed a full range of human expression. Cruelty, humor, racism, longing, and boredom. The past no longer felt morally distant or safely removed. It felt uncomfortably close. People living 2,000 years ago worried about money, status, relationships, and pleasure in ways that mirrored the concerns of the present. Pompeii suggested that progress had not changed fundamental human nature nearly as much as modern societies preferred to believe. The specific way the city had been preserved only amplified this discomfort. Other ancient sites were ruins shaped by centuries of gradual collapse, reuse, and erosion. Pompeii was fundamentally different. It had not worn down slowly over time. It had been stopped. That sudden halt captured moments that history normally erases from the record. Work left unfinished, messages written halfway, food in the middle of preparation. The absence of any closure made everything feel unresolved. Walking through Pompeii did not feel like observing some distant past. It felt like intruding on something deeply private. As excavation work expanded, so did ethical debate. How much should actually be uncovered? Every wall exposed to the air was also a wall newly endangered. The same ash that had preserved the city had also protected it from weather, from plants, from people. Removing it meant actively inviting decay. Archaeology became an ethical balancing act between the pursuit of knowledge and the necessity of preservation. Pompeii forced scholars to directly confront a genuine paradox. To save the past, certain parts of it might need to remain buried forever. Public fascination only complicated this existing tension. Pompeii was not just studied by academics, it was consumed by the public. Tourists arrived in steadily growing numbers, drawn by the shock of recognition, by the emotional weight of seeing lives frozen in crisis. The city became a destination not because it offered beauty, but because it offered honesty. It provided something rare, direct access to a moment humanity usually hides from itself. Death without ceremony, disaster without assigned meaning. Over time, Pompeii also reshaped how disasters themselves were conceptually understood. It provided clear evidence that catastrophes do not unfold as clean, linear narratives. There is no single moment of collapse, no unified response from the population. There is confusion, contradiction, and wildly unequal outcomes. Some people nearly escaped, others died just steps from safety. Pompeii demonstrated that survival is often arbitrary, shaped by timing, chance, and small decisions, rather than by character or perceived worth. That lesson resonated far beyond the field of archaeology. The city's rediscovery also raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of memory itself. Pompeii was not remembered because its people had been important. It was remembered because it had been buried in one very specific way. Countless other cities vanished without leaving any trace, their stories lost entirely to time. Pompeii survived not because it somehow deserved to, but because conditions happened to align in a particular manner. History, the city implied, is not a fair or comprehensive record. It is a fragile one, shaped as much by accident as by any genuine significance. As centuries passed following its rediscovery, Pompeii continued to change and evolve. New techniques revealed details that earlier excavators had either missed entirely or accidentally destroyed. Old interpretations faced challenges. The city refused to settle into any single fixed meaning. Each generation approached it differently, seeing in it reflections of its own particular fears and priorities. Industrial societies saw a warning about the power of nature. Modern urban cultures saw a mirror reflecting themselves. Scientists saw valuable data. Visitors saw tragedy. The influence of Pompeii refused to remain contained within museum walls or the pages of history books. Scientists, urban planners, and government officials began examining the city with greater attention, and it gradually entered broader discussions concerning risk assessment, emergency preparedness, and the delicate relationship connecting human settlements to the natural world. No longer was the eruption that consumed Pompeii viewed as merely an isolated tragedy from antiquity. It had transformed into a case study, a documented example that drew connections between ancient events and contemporary anxieties in ways that felt increasingly urgent. Disasters had been understood for centuries as acts of fate or expressions of divine anger. Pompeii undermined that entire framework. The evidence demonstrated clearly that the city had not been destroyed as punishment for recklessness or moral failure, but because its inhabitants had fundamentally misunderstood their environment. The danger had not been hidden from view. It had been misinterpreted, normalized over time, and ultimately dismissed. This realization carried implications that were difficult to ignore. Modern societies were not nearly as different as they preferred to imagine themselves. Volcanology began emerging as a legitimate scientific discipline, and Pompeii, along with its surrounding region, became essential to that development. The layers of ash and pumice created a detailed record of how eruptions progress, how rapidly conditions can shift, and how devastating invisible forces such as heat and gas can prove to be. The city helped researchers understand something crucial. The most dangerous phases of an eruption are frequently not the most visually dramatic ones. Falling ash that appears survivable can serve as merely a prelude to something far more lethal. This understanding would eventually inform evacuation protocols, hazard mapping, and emergency response plans across the globe. Despite all this systematic analysis, Pompeii never became purely an academic subject. It consistently resisted abstraction. Every new discovery redirected attention back to the human dimension. Footprints preserved in hardened ash, a door that had been barricaded from inside. A collection of valuable items gathered and hidden, suggesting the owner had intended to return. These specific details disrupted neat theoretical frameworks. They served as reminders that disaster is not experienced as an abstract model or a statistical graph, but as a sequence of confused, emotionally charged decisions made under extreme pressure. The city also complicated thinking about memory and collective responsibility. Pompeii was preserved precisely because no one ever returned for it. No rebuilding occurred, no cleanup took place, no narrative was rewritten afterward. Modern disasters rarely permit that kind of extended pause. Ruins get cleared, cities undergo reconstruction, physical evidence disappears in the name of recovery. Pompeii stood as evidence that forgetting is frequently an active choice, motivated by the psychological need to move forward. Its survival was not merely geological, it was psychological as well. It endured because it was abandoned. As tourism expanded around the site, another tension began to surface. Pompeii evolved into a destination people visited not only to learn, but to experience something emotional. Shock, grief, awe, even morbid fascination. Walking through its streets could produce a voyeuristic sensation, as though one were intruding on the immediate aftermath of a tragedy never intended for observation. This dynamic raised questions lacking simple answers. How should a location of mass death be presented to visitors? Where does legitimate education cross over into spectacle? Pompeii forced these questions into public awareness simply through its existence. The narrative flows onward from this point, not moving away from Pompeii but radiating outward from it, extending into the present and beyond. The buried city becomes a point of reference, a silent presence accompanying modern life, offering reminders that civilization is constructed not only upward through progress, but also balanced precariously on trust. Trust in land, in systems, in continuity. Once broken, trust rarely provides advance warning of its impending failure. What disturbed many observers was not merely how suddenly Pompeii met its end, but how entirely reasonable its choices had appeared at the time. Those who chose to stay were not being foolish. They were exercising the kind of caution most humans practice, weighing visible danger against immediate disruption to their lives. Departure meant abandoning property, sacrificing livelihoods, severing social connections. Remaining felt like the rational choice until quite suddenly it wasn't. Pompeii revealed how risk assessment rarely operates in absolutes. It gets negotiated emotionally, socially, and economically. This insight resonated powerfully in a world increasingly shaped by complex threats that do not materialize all at once. As global populations expanded and technology accelerated the pace of daily existence, The lessons embedded in Pompeii began feeling less historical and more diagnostic in nature. It illustrated how tightly interconnected systems amplify shocks when they occur. Water, food, transportation, communication, when these fail simultaneously, collapse accelerates dramatically. The city demonstrated that breakdown rarely follows a linear path. It cascades instead. One failure triggers the next until recovery becomes impossible. Pompeii did not fall because a single thing went wrong. It fell because multiple systems failed at once, moving faster than people could possibly adapt. This understanding shifted how disasters were conceptually framed. Instead of questioning why people failed to flee sooner, scholars and planners began asking why departure is so inherently difficult. Pompeii offered answers embedded in its physical design. The city had been constructed for efficiency and comfort, not for flexibility. Its density, its narrow roadways, its reliance on shared infrastructure all contributed to smoother daily life, while quietly eliminating options during crisis. The same fundamental trade-offs exist in contemporary cities, only magnified by scale. Pompeii also disrupted conventional ideas about progress. By Roman standards, it had been a successful city. It benefited from sophisticated engineering, extensive regional trade, and cultural vitality. None of that ultimately saved it. Progress did not insulate Pompeii from natural forces. It simply enabled more people to live comfortably in closer proximity to danger. This realization challenged a modern worldview constructed on the assumption that technological advancement inherently increases safety. At the same time, Pompeii resisted reduction to a simple cautionary tale. It did not advocate for restraint or withdrawal from risk. The Romans who inhabited the city were not reckless thrill seekers deliberately courting disaster. They were optimizing their lives for the world as they understood it. What Pompeii suggests is that danger often emerges not from extreme behavior, but from ordinary decisions repeated consistently over time. Comfort accumulates gradually. Risk becomes normalized through familiarity. What initially felt provisional transforms into something perceived as permanent. This explains why Pompeii retains such emotional power. It does not portray collapse as punishment or failure. It portrays it as interruption. Lives were not concluded according to any natural arc. They were severed mid-motion. This quality of incompleteness echoes in contemporary anxieties about sudden change, about systems that feel solid until they abruptly aren't. Pompeii gives tangible form to a fear many people struggle to articulate, that stability might be nothing more than an illusion sustained only by repetition and habit. Narrative. Pompeii ceased being merely a symbol and became a community again, populated by individuals possessing preferences, flaws, and daily routines. The more human the city became in modern understanding, the more difficult it became to maintain emotional distance from its fate. The story resists resolution because resolution was never its purpose. Pompeii does not prescribe specific actions. It shows what unfolds when certainty moves faster than understanding. It offers reminders that civilizations do not always collapse from internal decay or fall to external enemies. Sometimes they simply misinterpret the ground beneath them. From this point, the narrative continues widening, not away from Pompeii, but moving through it into how modern societies determine which risks to accept, which dangers to disregard, and which narratives they construct to make uncertainty bearable. The buried city remains precisely where it is, but its meaning keeps shifting, following us forward, asking quietly whether we would recognize warning signs any more clearly if the ground began changing again beneath our feet. That quiet question, whether recognition would arrive in time, lingers because no comfortable answer exists. Pompeii demonstrates that warning does not always manifest as a clear signal. Frequently, it arrives fragmented, ambiguous, easily explained away. The Romans experienced earthquakes and adapted to them. They repaired damaged walls and repainted rooms. What felt like successful recovery may have functioned as rehearsal instead. Each successful repair reinforced the conviction that the world was manageable, that disruption could be absorbed and normalcy restored. In this sense, Pompeii reveals something profoundly human. Resilience can transform into a trap when it teaches that survival yesterday guarantees safety tomorrow. Pompeii's enduring power emerges from this tension between intimacy and scale. On one level, it represents a single city destroyed by a single event. On another level, it functions as a condensed version of a pattern that repeats throughout history. Cities develop where resources are abundant. People adapt to existing risk. Normality solidifies. Then something changes faster than adaptation can accommodate. Pompeii is not unique in following this pattern. It is unique in how clearly it preserves every stage of it. This insight matters because it reframes catastrophe not as a break from normal existence, but as an extension of it. Disasters do not arrive in opposition to everyday systems. They exploit them. The same networks that sustain life, roads, buildings, supply chains, transform into channels for collapse. Pompeii's streets guided people toward markets and baths for centuries. In the final hours, those identical streets guided fear, confusion, and deadly crowding. As the narrative progresses forward, Pompeii ceases being only about the past. It becomes a framework for thinking about uncertainty itself, about how societies decide which risks are acceptable, which dangers feel distant enough to ignore, and which stories get told to keep fear manageable. Pompeii does not argue that people should live in constant anxiety. It suggests something more subtle and considerably more difficult, that comfort should never be confused with permanence. The buried city continues standing, not as a monument to failure, but as evidence of continuity. Human life before Pompeii resembled human life after it in fundamental ways. People planned, argued, loved, invested, repaired, and trusted. That continuity is what makes the story resonate so powerfully. Pompeii is not alien to modern experience. It is familiar, and that familiarity constitutes its sharpest edge. From here, the story keeps unfolding outward, carrying Pompeii's shadow into every discussion concerning cities, risk assessment, and collective memory. The ash has long since cooled completely. The streets have been thoroughly mapped, the bodies have been studied extensively, yet the city remains unfinished in meaning. It continues posing questions without demanding specific answers, content to remain unresolved, waiting for each generation to recognize itself briefly and uncomfortably in a place that never anticipated being remembered at all. This unresolved quality explains why Pompeii refuses to become just another historical chapter that can be closed. Even after centuries of excavation and scholarly interpretation, it does not settle comfortably into the past. It keeps drifting forward, intersecting with new anxieties as they surface. Each era projects its own particular concerns onto the city, and the city absorbs them without offering resistance. To a world shaped by industrialization, Pompeii appeared as a warning about nature's raw power. To a world shaped by urban sprawl and climate stress, it appears as a lesson about density, exposure, and denial. The city itself never changes, yet its meaning never remains still. As the city continued being studied, scholars began noticing how deeply trust shaped every aspect of daily life. Trust that buildings would stand, trust that neighbors would behave predictably, trust that authorities would act when necessary, trust in the assumption that tomorrow would arrive. Pompeii shows how trust, while essential for social cohesion, can also slow response when conditions shift abruptly. The same systems that make life efficient also encourage people to defer judgment, to assume continuity, to wait for confirmation that never arrives in time. Pompeii does not insist that disaster is inevitable. It does not argue that cities are mistakes or that progress should cease. Instead, it invites humility. It suggests that understanding the past is not about extracting lessons that guarantee safety, but about recognizing patterns that resist certainty. The city's survival into the present is not proof that history can be controlled. It is proof that history can surprise us, preserve what it destroys, and speak long after voices have gone permanently silent. And the narrative keeps flowing forward, carrying Pompeii with it, not as a memory locked in ash, but as a living reference point. A reminder that civilizations are not only defined by how they rise or how they fall, but by how confidently they assume the ground beneath them will remain exactly as it is. That confidence, quiet, habitual, almost invisible, forms the final thread binding Pompeii to every city that comes after it. Confidence is not arrogance. It does not feel reckless while occurring. It feels like normalcy. It feels like the absence of urgency. Pompeii reminds us that most collapses do not begin with alarm, but with reassurance, with the belief that things have always functioned and therefore will continue functioning a little longer. This selective attention shaped not only where Pompeii was constructed, but how life was lived within it. Buildings rose close together. Streets remained narrow. Infrastructure prioritized daily efficiency over emergency movement. None of these were mistakes. They were optimizations for the present. Pompeii demonstrates how optimization, taken far enough, can quietly eliminate resilience. When everything works well, alternatives disappear. What lingers most powerfully is not the moment of destruction, but the moment before it, the hours of ordinary life, the assumptions still intact. That is where the city speaks most clearly to the present. It suggests that the most important historical question is not why things fall apart, but why they feel so solid, right up until they don't. This explains why Pompeii remains endlessly revisited, not because it offers closure, but because it denies it. Each walk through its streets feels unfinished. Each room suggests a future that never arrived. That absence creates space for reflection, not just about the past, but about the present moment and how it will eventually be read. The city does not accuse, it does not warn loudly, it simply exists, preserved in interruption. Its message, if it can be called that, is subtle and persistent, that history is shaped as much by what feels safe as by what feels dangerous, and that the difference between the two is often far less stable than it appears. In this sense, Pompeii exposes a flaw in how people imagine the past. We tend to believe that those who lived before us sensed the weight of their moment, that they stood closer to meaning, closer to consequence. Pompeii denies that comfort. Its streets show that people lived forward, not backward. They did not know they were standing inside a story that would be told for thousands of years. They were simply inside their lives. That realization alters the relationship between memory and significance. Pompeii matters now because of what happened to it, but to its inhabitants, it mattered because it was home. Their attachment was practical, emotional, and unremarkable. They invested in it because it rewarded them. They trusted it because it had earned that trust repeatedly. The city was not a gamble, it was a foundation. This fragmentation is part of what gives Pompeii its emotional weight. It refuses to be reduced to a lesson that can be summarized neatly. Every attempt to extract a single meaning runs into evidence that pushes back. The city contains caution and coincidence, vulnerability and resilience, ignorance and adaptation. It does not resolve into morality. It remains stubbornly human. And yet, despite this erosion, Pompeii endures in a way few places do. It endures not as a monument to triumph or failure, but as a record of continuity interrupted. It shows how closely life and loss coexist, how quickly one can become the other, and how little ceremony that transition requires. The city does not dramatize its own importance. It lets the ordinary speak for itself. And as long as cities continue to rise on foundations that feel dependable, as long as daily life feels stable enough to trust, the buried streets will remain relevant. Pompeii will continue to speak, not because it demands attention, but because it reflects it, showing us that the line between ordinary and historic is thinner than it ever appears, and that most of the time we cross it without noticing at all. I'll perform a complete structural rewrite of this final section, maintaining all facts while significantly changing sentence construction and flow. What remains after walking its streets, whether physically or through careful study, is a recognition that modern life rests on remarkably similar assumptions. Cities expand because expansion works. Systems grow increasingly complex because complexity delivers measurable efficiency. Risk gets managed through statistics, averaged out, relegated to the background. What Pompeii reminds us is that averages provide little comfort to individuals, and that rare events remain rare only until they actually occur. The city did not experience abstract probability. It experienced concrete consequence. In this manner, Pompeii quietly dismantles the notion that history represents a march toward safety. It suggests instead that history represents movement toward complexity, and that complexity carries distinct risks of its own. The more intricate a system becomes, the more pathways exist for failure to spread. Pompeii was not fragile because it was simple, it was fragile because it was interconnected. That negotiation remains visible even in Pompeii's afterlife. The effort to preserve it reflects recognition that memory itself requires constant maintenance. Left completely alone, the city would disappear again, this time gradually. Remembering is work, forgetting is effortless. Pompeii survives because people choose to keep engaging with it, to keep questioning what it means, even when the answers prove uncomfortable. Perhaps that represents the final continuity Pompeii offers. Not a lesson about disaster, but about attention itself, about the value of looking closely at ordinary life, at the structures supporting it, and at the assumptions that quietly shape decisions. The city does not demand that we predict the future. It suggests that understanding the present more honestly might be sufficient. Pompeii also reveals how rapidly familiarity dulls awareness. Those who lived there did not wake each day actively choosing to ignore danger. They woke, choosing to live. Danger remained abstract. Life remained concrete. Over time, abstraction always loses. This is not a flaw unique to the Romans. It is a pattern embedded deeply in human behavior. Pompeii preserves that pattern with unusual clarity because it froze the moment before abstraction transformed into consequence. There is something profoundly unsettling about how calm much of the physical evidence feels. In many locations, no signs exist of frantic evacuation or prolonged struggle. Instead, there are indications of people making small, rational adjustments, closing doors, gathering possessions, staying together. These are not the actions of panic. They are the actions of people still operating within a framework of normality, adjusting their behavior incrementally rather than radically. What Pompeii shows is how disaster often outpaces imagination, arriving faster than people can mentally shift from adaptation to escape. This explains why Pompeii does not function well as a simple warning. Warnings imply clarity. Pompeii offers ambiguity instead. It shows that by the time danger becomes undeniable, options have often narrowed beyond recovery. The city suggests that the most critical decisions are not made during crisis, but long before it, embedded in where people build, how they organize space, and what risks they normalize in exchange for comfort. As the modern world continues grappling with uncertainty, environmental change, technological dependence, urban vulnerability, Pompeii remains a quiet reference point, not because it predicts specific outcomes, but because it clarifies underlying processes. It shows how systems drift toward fragility without noticing, how stability can mask accumulation of risk, how endings often arrive through continuity rather than rupture. In the end, Pompeii is not a story about a city that failed. It is a story about a city that functioned right up until it didn't. That distinction matters considerably. Failure implies deviation from some standard. Pompeii followed its path exactly as designed. The eruption did not expose weakness so much as it exposed limits, limits of understanding, limits of prediction, limits of control. The story continues to move forward, not toward resolution, but toward recognition. Pompeii does not ask to be feared or revered, it asks to be noticed. As long as people continue living inside systems that feel stable, trusting ground that feels solid, and assuming that tomorrow will look enough like today, the buried city will remain quietly relevant, its story flowing alongside ours, uninterrupted, waiting for attention rather than demanding it. That is where its role subtly changes. Pompeii today exists in a state of careful contradiction. It is opened so it can be understood, but in opening it, it is also slowly worn away. Sunlight fades pigments that survived darkness for centuries. Rain enters spaces once sealed. Footsteps erode stone that ash had protected. Preservation becomes a negotiation between access and loss. There is no perfect solution, only management of decline. The same forces that once caused the city to vanish now threaten it in reverse. Not sudden destruction, but slow erosion. Not ash and fire, but neglect, overuse, and time. Pompeii was preserved by stillness. Now it must survive motion, and yet people continue to walk its streets. They come searching for connection, for understanding, for proof that the past was real, and populated by people who felt familiar emotions. They photograph walls, study casts, trace doorways with their eyes. In doing so, they add another layer to the city's story. Not Roman, but modern, Pompeii becomes a shared space between eras, shaped as much by those who observe it as by those who once lived there. From destruction to rediscovery to reflection, and now into the quieter territory of ethics, preservation, and collective memory. Pompeii continues to exist not because it must, but because it is continuously chosen. Pompeii's uneasy attraction lies precisely in that tension between learning and looking. It is a place people visit to understand history, yet the act of visiting turns history into something consumed. Paths are marked, viewpoints suggested, moments framed. What was once private, homes, bedrooms, kitchens, becomes public space. The city that never chose to be seen becomes one of the most watched places in the ancient world. Modern culture struggles with this contradiction. On one hand, Pompeii educates. It makes the past tangible. It resists abstraction and forces recognition of ordinary human lives. On the other hand, it risks turning catastrophe into spectacle. The more familiar the sight becomes, the easier it is to forget that it is also a mass grave. That forgetting is rarely intentional. It emerges gradually through repetition, through routine, through the normalization of access. Tourism accelerates this process. Large numbers of visitors compress experience into highlights, into moments designed to be quickly understood and easily shared. Complexity gives way to immediacy. Context thins. The city becomes a backdrop rather than a presence. Pompeii begins to function like an exhibit rather than a place. And the line between engagement and consumption grows increasingly blurred. What complicates this further is that Pompeii does not repel viewers, it draws them in. The city is visually rich, emotionally charged, and deeply human. That attraction is not shallow curiosity, it is recognition. People see themselves in its rooms, its habits, its unfinished gestures. The danger lies not in that recognition, but in letting familiarity dull sensitivity. Pompeii asks whether it is possible to look carefully without consuming, to observe without owning, to remember without reducing. These are not questions archaeology can resolve alone. They belong to culture, ethics, and collective choice. Every decision about how Pompeii is presented reflects contemporary values as much as ancient realities. The story moves forward again from here, not away from Pompeii, but deeper into what it represents, into how societies remember suffering, how they frame loss, and how easily meaning can slip when repetition replaces reflection. The buried city remains where it is, but its challenge follows us into museums, into memorials, into every place where the past is put on display and the present decides how to look at it. That challenge does not end at Pompeii's gates. It extends outward into how modern societies choose to engage with all sites of loss and memory. Pompeii becomes a reference point not because it is unique in tragedy, but because it is unusually legible. Its clarity makes it a testing ground for questions that apply everywhere. How much should be revealed, who decides, and what responsibility the living carry toward the dead. This creates a paradox. To keep Pompeii meaningful, it must be engaged with. But engagement risks erosion, both physical and emotional. Preservation teams work to slow material decay, but there is no equivalent process to preserve sensitivity. No barrier can prevent the gradual normalization of tragedy. The only defense against that erosion is intentional framing, context, education, restraint, and even those are imperfect. From here, the narrative naturally opens further, moving beyond Pompeii itself into the broader human relationship with disaster, memory, and meaning. The city becomes a lens rather than a subject, a way of seeing rather than an object to be explained. Its streets lead outward into questions that no single place can answer, but that every society must face. The city's endurance depends on resisting that narrowing, on allowing Pompeii to remain layered, contradictory, and unfinished. This is difficult work. Simplicity is easier. Clean narratives travel further, but Pompeii loses its force when reduced. Its power lies in friction, in the discomfort of standing inside a place that refuses to resolve into a single meaning. This is where memory reveals itself as a cultural practice rather than passive inheritance. Societies do not simply remember, they curate remembrance. They decide what is accessible, what is highlighted, what is softened, and what is left to fade. Pompeii makes that process visible because its preservation is so deliberate. Every cleared street, every stabilized wall, every guided route is a choice. Together, these choices construct a version of the past that can be entered without overwhelming the present. As this section draws toward its quiet end, the focus settles on this idea that remembrance is not guaranteed by exposure and meaning is not preserved by access alone. Both require discipline. Pompeii survives not because it is famous, but because it continues to demand careful engagement. The moment it becomes easy, it begins to lose what makes it matter. Living beside risk is not something societies choose all at once. It happens gradually through adjustment rather than decision. At first, danger feels sharp and intrusive. It disrupts language, routines, expectations. Over time, however, it is absorbed. Measures are taken, terms are coined, boundaries are drawn. What once felt extraordinary becomes part of the background. Pompeii illuminates this process in reverse, showing what it looks like when the background suddenly pushes forward and demands attention again. Rational, even compassionate, they allow societies to function. But Pompeii reminds us that every framework is provisional. Every story that restores calm also narrows vision. Once danger is explained, it becomes predictable. Once it is predictable, it becomes negotiable. And once it is negotiable, it can be postponed. Pompeii sits at the far end of that sequence, where postponement ran out of time. The city does not condemn the process, it exposes its endpoint. It shows what happens when explanation succeeds too well at keeping fear manageable. This is why Pompeii continues to unsettle long after its details are known. The facts are stable, the discomfort is not. Each generation inherits the same evidence and draws different boundaries around it. What one era treats as warning, another treats as context. What once provoked anxiety becomes absorbed into expertise, knowledge accumulates, and with it, confidence returns. Confidence is not the enemy, it is the engine of continuity. But Pompeii insists on a distinction that is easy to lose. Confidence is not certainty. The Romans were confident in their city. Modern societies are confident in their systems. In both cases, that confidence was earned through repetition. It felt justified, and that is precisely why it was dangerous. Pompeii does not ask people to abandon confidence. It asks them to notice it, to recognize when confidence shifts from informed trust into invisible assumption. That shift is subtle. It happens gradually through success rather than failure. The city's lesson, if it can be called that, is not about fear, but about attention, about maintaining awareness even when things appear to be working. As this movement settles, the narrative reaches a natural pause, not an ending, but a hinge. Pompeii has carried the story from life to loss to memory to ethics to interpretation. It has shown how cities function, how disasters interrupt, how meaning is constructed afterward, and how that meaning gradually becomes part of the background again. From here, the story is ready to turn once more. The next layer does not belong to Pompeii alone. It belongs to all places where people live beside forces they cannot fully control, all societies that build explanations sturdy enough to stand on, but light enough to live with. Pompeii will remain present, not as a warning sign, but as a reference point. A reminder of what explanation can do and what it cannot. The ground does not need to move for the story to continue. It only needs to feel solid. And that is where the narrative quietly prepares to step next. Vesuvius is still there today, better mapped, closely monitored, measured constantly by instruments that promise early warning and control. Yet, beneath that confidence remains the same fundamental truth. The mountain has not changed its nature, only our interpretation of it. People still live along its slopes, cities still grow nearby. Daily life still unfolds under the assumption that danger, while possible, is unlikely to arrive now. Knowledge has expanded, but proximity remains. This coexistence with risk feels rational. It always has. Pompeii teaches that living near danger is rarely experienced as recklessness. It is experienced as normalcy stretched over time. The presence of monitoring systems does not remove uncertainty, it simply reframes it. Risk becomes something managed, scheduled, discussed, until the moment it is not. Over time, this pattern repeats far beyond volcanoes. Cities rise near fault lines, coastlines, floodplains. Technology gives warning, models give probability, and confidence quietly returns. Pompeii does not argue against progress or preparation. It reveals how easily preparation becomes reassurance, and reassurance becomes assumption. The city's deeper relevance lies here, not in ash or ruins, but in how humans negotiate uncertainty. Danger rarely feels dramatic while it is being lived. Beside, it feels abstract, distant, conditional. Life continues because it must. The lesson is not that people ignore warnings, but that warnings must compete with routine, attachment, and hope. As the story moves toward its close, Pompeii becomes less a place and more a mirror. It reflects a human tendency that has not changed, the need to believe that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough to plan for it. That belief is not foolish, it is necessary, but it is also fragile. Pompeii endures because it captures the moment when that belief quietly failed, not through moral collapse or ignorance, but through the ordinary act of trusting the ground beneath one's feet. Its final message is not fear, but humility, an invitation to recognize that certainty is always provisional and that the line between stability and disruption is thinner than it appears. The city never knew it would be remembered. It never knew it would become a reference point for centuries of reflection. It simply lived confidently, normally, until it didn't. And that is why its story does not end in the past. It continues wherever people build, trust, settle, and assume continuity. Under skies that look calm, on ground that feels solid, on days that seem, in every way, ordinary. I'll perform a complete structural rewrite of this final concluding section, maintaining all facts while significantly changing sentence construction and flow. Modern cities frequently believe themselves to be different, more advanced in their approach, better informed about risks, protected by comprehensive data, sophisticated technology, and genuine foresight. This belief provides comfort, and it seems earned through effort. Yet it is also strikingly familiar. Pompeii was not ignorant about risk. It was confident in its capacity to live alongside it. Cities today make the same fundamental calculation, simply using different language. Sensors have replaced omens, sophisticated models have replaced intuition. But the underlying assumption remains. Unchanged, that danger will provide notice, and that when it does, sufficient time will exist to respond. This is the Pompeii illusion, the conviction that progress creates distance from vulnerability. In reality, progress frequently concentrates it instead. Larger populations cluster together, infrastructure grows denser, interdependence deepens, systems grow more efficient and therefore less flexible in nature. When disruption finally comes, it travels faster, not slower. Pompeii did not fall because it lacked knowledge. It fell because life had been optimized for the world as it usually was. Over time, what once felt unthinkable becomes normal again. Risk settles into the background, warnings are absorbed into routine, preparedness becomes policy, then paperwork, then assumption. This is not carelessness, it is how societies survive psychologically. Constant alarm is unsustainable. Normalization is not failure, it is adaptation. What Pompeii shows, however, is that adaptation carries a cost. The more danger is normalized, the harder it becomes to recognize when conditions have actually changed. The cycle repeats itself: shock, attention, explanation, normality, forgetting, not because people fail to learn, but because learning must coexist with living. Pompeii possesses power because it preserves the entire arc at once. It shows the moment before disruption, the moment of collapse itself, and the long silence after, compressed into a single place. What Pompeii ultimately tells us is not how to avoid disaster, but how to understand ourselves within it. It reveals that humans are not undone by ignorance alone, but by trust in systems, in land, in continuity. That trust is not a flaw. It is the foundation of civilization, but it is also its vulnerability. The city does not ask us to abandon that trust. It asks us to hold it lightly, to remember that stability is negotiated, not guaranteed, that certainty is provisional, that the ordinary carries more weight than we tend to notice. Pompeii never knew it was standing at the edge of history. It was living inside habit, confidence, and routine. That is why its story endures, not because it is ancient, but because it is recognizable. The streets remain quiet now, the ash long cooled, the mountain still standing. What remains is not a warning carved in stone, but a question left open. How many of our own assumptions feel just as solid? How many of our days feel just as ordinary? History rarely announces itself. Most of the time, it arrives disguised as normal life. Normal life provides the perfect disguise. It is quiet, persuasive, and deeply convincing. People do not ignore history, they simply live forward while history waits behind them. What Pompeii shows is that civilizations are not undone by dramatic mistakes, but by long stretches of success that make caution feel unnecessary. Stability becomes proof, routine becomes evidence, and evidence replaces imagination. Over time, the extraordinary fades. What once felt like a warning becomes a reference. What once demanded attention becomes familiar enough to pass without stopping. This is how forgetting works, not through denial, but through comfort. Pompeii survives precisely because it interrupts that comfort. It forces the present to confront how thin the boundary is between continuity and collapse. Yet, the city offers no final judgment. It does not argue that humans should retreat or fear progress or abandon the places that reward them. It simply shows the cost of certainty. It reminds us that every system, no matter how advanced, rests on assumptions that cannot be fully tested until they fail. Knowledge grows, but uncertainty never disappears. It only changes form. What makes Pompeii endure is that it captures humanity mid-stride, not at the moment of reflection, and not at the moment of ruin, but in between, in the act of trusting, in the act of continuing. That is where most lives are lived. That is where history usually intervenes. The city never intended to leave a message. It never prepared a legacy. It did not know it would become a mirror held up to centuries yet to come. It lived as people always have, confident that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to plan for it. And that confidence was not foolish, it was necessary. Pompeii matters because it preserves that necessity without romanticizing it. It shows that civilization is built not on foresight but on faith. Faith in ground, in systems, in repetition. That faith enables life. It also makes interruption devastating when it arrives. In the end, Pompeii does not stand as a symbol of failure. It stands as evidence of continuity, of people doing what people have always done, building, trusting, adapting, and assuming time is on their side. Its story does not end in ash. It continues wherever cities rise, wherever risk is normalized, wherever ordinary days feel safely unremarkable. The mountain still stands, the streets remain silent, and the question Pompeii leaves behind is not what went wrong, but how familiar everything felt before it did. History rarely announces itself. Most of the time it arrives quietly on a day that feels like any other. And once the story reaches that point, it no longer belongs to Pompeii alone. It belongs to every place where people wake up believing the day will unfold as expected, to every city built on land that feels generous, to every system trusted because it has not yet failed. Pompeii lingers not as a prediction, but as a reminder that history is shaped less by catastrophe than by confidence. What endures is not the ash or the ruins or even the mountain. What endures is the pattern, the way humans make peace with uncertainty by pushing it just far enough away to live, the way stability becomes invisible precisely because it works, the way interruption always feels impossible until it isn't. Pompeii does not ask us to live in fear. It asks us to live with awareness, to recognize that continuity is not guaranteed, but chosen again and again through trust. That trust is not weakness, it is what allows life to exist at all. But it carries weight, and that weight is easiest to forget when the ground feels solid. The city remains where it is, quiet and exposed, offering no instructions and no comfort. It does not tell us how to prevent the next disaster or where it will come from. It only shows us who we are just before history notices us. And that may be its final truth. Not that civilizations fall, not that nature is unforgiving, but that most of the time the world ends for people who were simply living their lives, confident, busy, distracted, on a day that felt completely ordinary.